No dictator in world history had ever issued such an open death threat to Ibrahim Traoré as Kim Jong Un had, because none of them knew how powerful Traoré was in the heart of Pyongyang. The secure communication room deep beneath the Ryugyong Hotel in Pyongyang hummed with electronic surveillance equipment as Kim Jong Un's voice echoed through the bunker with barely contained rage. It was 2:30 a.m. North Korean time on a bitter December night in 2023, and the supreme leader of North Korea was about to make what would become the most catastrophic decision of his reign. "Comrade General," Kim Jong Un addressed his chief of intelligence, standing before a wall of monitors displaying satellite feeds from across Africa. "This African insect has become more than an irritation. He is now a direct threat to our strategic interests." The African insect Kim Jong Un was referring to was Ibrahim Traoré, whose recent actions had disrupted North Korea's carefully planned expansion into African market. Over the past year, Traoré had systematically exposed and dismantled North Korean mining operations, arms dealing networks, and currency laundering schemes that had been operating across West Africa for over a decade. What Kim Jong Un didn't know was that every word of this conversation was being transmitted in real time to a listening post in Ouagadougou, where Ibrahim Traoré sat calmly reviewing intelligence reports that detailed the full scope of North Korea's African operations. The transmission was possible because of an asset that Traoré had cultivated years earlier, someone so close to Kim Jong Un that their betrayal would have been inconceivable to the North Korean leader. "Supreme Leader," the intelligence chief replied nervously, "President Traoré has proven surprisingly resilient to our usual methods of persuasion. Perhaps a more diplomatic approach." Kim Jong Un's fist slammed against the metal table, causing several intelligence officers to flinch visibly. "Diplomacy? This African upstart has cost us over $2 billion in lost revenue. He has exposed our uranium procurement networks. He has turned our African partners against us." The losses Kim Jong Un referenced were indeed staggering. Burkina Faso's investigation into North Korean activities had triggered a domino effect across the continent. Mali had expelled North Korean military advisor. Niger had canceled arms purchases worth $300 million. Chad had frozen North Korean bank accounts containing over $150 million in laundered funds. "I want Ibrahim Traoré eliminated," Kim Jong Un declared, his voice carrying the absolute authority of someone accustomed to having his death sentences carried out without question. "I don't care if it starts a diplomatic crisis. I don't care if it exposes our African operations. This man dies within 30 days. What Kim Jong Un was about to discover was that Ibrahim Traoré had been anticipating this exact moment for months. The African president had not stumbled upon North Korean operations by accident. He had been systematically hunting them as part of a broader campaign to eliminate foreign criminal networks from African soil. 3 hours after Kim Jong Un's death order, Traoré's secure phone rang in the presidential palace in Ouagadougou. The caller's voice was familiar. Dr. Park Sang-mi, officially listed as a translator in the North Korean Foreign Ministry, but actually Kim Jong Un's most trusted advisor and, unknown to anyone in Pyongyang, Ibrahim Traoré's most valuable intelligence asset. "Mr. President," Dr. Park spoke in perfect English, her voice carefully controlled despite the gravity of what she was reporting. "The Supreme Leader has issued direct orders for your assassination. 3 separate teams are being deployed through our African network." Dr. Park's defection to Traoré's cause had begun 2 years earlier, not through ideological conversion, but through a personal tragedy that had opened her eyes to the true nature of the regime she served. Her brother, a North Korean diplomat, had been executed on Kim Jong Un's orders for questioning the ethics of weapons sales to African dictators. Her cooperation with Traoré was both revenge and redemption. "Dr. Park," Traoré replied calmly, "are you in immediate danger?" "Not yet. The Supreme Leader trusts me completely. He has no idea that I've been providing you with intelligence. But Mr. President, these assassination teams are different from anything North Korea has deployed before. They're authorized to use chemical weapons, radioactive materials, even suicide attackers." Traoré had been expecting escalation, but the scope of Kim Jong Un's response was more extreme than anticipated. The North Korean leader was essentially declaring war on a sovereign African nation rather than accepting the loss of his criminal operations. "Dr. Park, I need you to maintain your position for 72 more hours. Can you do that? Yes, Mr. President. But what are you planning? Traoré's answer would have sounded like madness to anyone who didn't understand the depth of preparation he had invested in this moment. I'm going to end Kim Jong Un's regime tonight. What Dr. Park didn't know was that Traoré had spent the past 18 months building an underground network within North Korea itself, a coalition of dissidents, military officers, and government officials who had grown increasingly disillusioned with Kim Jong Un's brutal rule. The network, codenamed Operation Sunrise, had been dormant until this moment, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. The plan Traoré was about to implement had taken 2 years to develop and involved coordination with intelligence services from 6 different countries, none of which were traditional allies of North Korea. It would unfold simultaneously in Pyongyang, at North Korean embassies worldwide, and across the network of front companies that Kim Jong Un used to fund his regime. At exactly 8 p.m. Pyongyang time, as Kim Jong Un was hosting a dinner for Chinese economic advisors, the first phase of Operation Sunrise began. In the basement of the Pyongyang metro system, a team of North Korean electrical engineers, all of whom had lost family members to Kim Jong Un's purges, initiated a carefully planned power grid failure that would cripple the city's surveillance systems for exactly 47 minutes. Simultaneously, in a luxury apartment building in Pyongyang's diplomatic quarter, 5 North Korean military officers entered Kim Jong Un's personal command bunker using access codes provided by Dr. Park. Their mission was not assassination, that would have made them martyrs for Kim Jong Un's cause, but something far more devastating to a dictator who ruled through fear, complete humiliation. The officers, led by Colonel Lee Min-ho, whose father had been executed for insufficient loyalty 3 years earlier, made their way to Kim Jong Un's private office, where they began photographing and copying thousands of classified documents. These files contained evidence of personal corruption, detailed plans for maintaining power through mass murder, and most damaging of all, Kim Jong Un's private communications revealing his deep insecurities and psychological instability. But the most crucial element of the operation was taking place in Kim Jong Un's personal residence, where his own security detail, handpicked for loyalty but secretly recruited by Traoré's network, was installing hidden cameras and recording devices in every room. For the first time in North Korean history, the supreme leader's private life would be completely exposed to the world. Phase 2 of Operation Sunrise activated at 9:15 p.m. when North Korean cyber warfare specialists, working secretly for Traoré, gained access to the state's internal communication networks. Instead of causing damage, they began broadcasting a simple message to every government computer, military terminal, and state television monitor in the country. Kim Jong Un has ordered the assassination of African President Ibrahim Traoré. This illegal act of international terrorism will bring devastating consequences to our people. The time has come to choose between our country's future and one man's madness. The message, signed by the Liberation Committee of North Korea, continued broadcasting despite frantic efforts by loyal security forces to shut down the transmission. More importantly, it was simultaneously being broadcast to the outside world, exposing Kim Jong Un's assassination plot to international media and foreign governments. But the most psychologically devastating blow came at 10:30 p.m., when Kim Jong Un returned to his residence after the Chinese dinner to find his private chambers filled with video screens showing live feeds from his most secret locations, his personal torture chambers, his gold storage vaults, and most damaging of all, the execution sites, where he had personally murdered hundreds of perceived enemies. As Kim Jong Un stared in horror at the screens showing his own crimes being broadcast to the world, his secure phone rang. The caller ID showed it was Dr. Park, but when he answered, the voice he heard was that of Ibrahim Traoré. Supreme Leader Kim. Traoré's voice was calm and conversational, as if he were discussing the weather rather than the complete destruction of a nuclear-armed dictatorship. I believe you wanted to speak with me about assassination. Kim Jong Un's voice cracked as he responded. How? How did you? How did I infiltrate your most secure facilities? How did I turn your own people against you? How did I access your personal communications? Traoré paused for effect. The same way you've been trying to infiltrate and control African nations for decades. The difference is that Africans are fighting back. On the screens around Kim Jong Un, footage began playing of North Korean operatives being arrested at embassies worldwide. In Berlin, London, Bangkok, and 12 other cities, North Korean diplomats and intelligence officers were being taken into custody as evidence of their African operations was released to local authorities. "You threatened to kill me," Traoré continued, "but you don't seem to understand that your regime exists only because the world has been willing to ignore your crimes. That willingness ends tonight." Kim Jong Un sank into a chair, watching his power structure collapse in real time on the screens surrounding him. What do you want? I want you to understand that Africa is no longer available for exploitation by anyone, not Western powers, not Eastern powers, and certainly not failed dictators who threaten African leaders with assassination. The final phase of Operation Sunrise was perhaps the most elegant. Instead of destroying Kim Jong Un's regime through violence, Traoré was demonstrating its complete vulnerability. Every secret facility, every classified communication, every hidden crime was being exposed simultaneously. The mystique of invincibility that kept Kim Jong Un in power was evaporating in a single night. "You have a choice," Traoré explained as footage of North Korean prison camps began broadcasting on state television inside North Korea. "You can continue threatening African leaders and face complete exposure of your regime's crimes, or you can withdraw all North Korean operations from Africa and never again interfere with African sovereignty." Kim Jong Un's response was barely audible. "And if I agree, then tonight's operation ends here. Your crimes remain documented but private. Your regime survives, but your African adventures end permanently." The silence stretched for nearly a minute as Kim Jong Un processed the impossible position he found himself in. A leader he had dismissed as insignificant had just demonstrated the power to destroy his regime without firing a single shot. "How do I know you won't release this information anyway? Because unlike you, Supreme Leader, I'm not interested in destroying North Korea. I'm interested in protecting Africa. Meet my conditions, and you'll never hear from me again." The conversation ended with Kim Jong Un's whispered agreement to withdraw all North Korean operations from African soil. Over the following week, North Korean personnel quietly evacuated from across the continent, taking with them decades of intelligence networks and criminal enterprises. The international ramifications of that night were profound. Intelligence agencies worldwide suddenly understood that Ibrahim Traoré possessed operational capabilities that rivaled those of major powers. The casual ease with which he had penetrated North Korea's most secure facilities suggested intelligence networks and resources far beyond what anyone had attributed to a young African president. For Kim Jong Un, the humiliation was complete. His own propaganda had been turned against him. His security apparatus had proven completely compromised, and his reputation for invincibility had been destroyed by someone he had considered beneath his notice. 6 months later, at a summit of African leaders in Nairobi, Traoré reflected on the night that had ended North Korean interference in African affairs. "Many people asked how we managed to outmaneuver North Korea's intelligence services," he told the assembled president. "The answer is simple. They underestimated us because they saw us as Africans first and leaders second. Their racism became their weakness." The operation that had begun with Kim Jong Un's death threat had ended with his complete submission. Dr. Park, safely relocated to Switzerland with a new identity, had provided the final intelligence briefing showing North Korean facilities across Africa being abandoned and their personnel recalled to Pyongyang. The lesson was clear to dictators worldwide. The era when they could threaten African leaders without consequences was ending. Traoré had demonstrated that Africa possessed the intelligence capabilities, technological sophistication, and strategic patience to respond to threats with overwhelming force. Kim Jong Un never again mentioned Ibrahim Traoré's name in any communication, public or private. The North Korean leader, who had issued a death threat, had instead received a demonstration of his own mortality, not physical, but political. His regime survived only because an African president had chosen mercy over justice. The power dynamics that had characterized North-South relations for decades had been fundamentally altered in a single night. A dictator with nuclear weapons had been humbled by a leader he had tried to dismiss as irrelevant, proving that in the modern world, intelligence and preparation could defeat even the most brutal forms of power. The secret operation in Pyongyang had ended not with Kim Jong Un's death, but with something far more valuable, the death of his ability to threaten African sovereignty. The supreme leader, who had ruled through fear, had learned to fear someone he had never expected, an African president who refused to be intimidated by anyone, anywhere, for any reason. But the full ramifications of that night in Pyongyang would continue to unfold for months, reshaping not just North Korea's relationship with Africa, but the entire global understanding of African capabilities in intelligence and strategic operations. Within 48 hours of Kim Jong Un's capitulation, intelligence agencies across the world began reassessing their evaluation of African leadership capabilities. The CIA convened emergency briefings to analyze how an African president had achieved penetration of North Korean facilities that American intelligence had considered impenetrable. The British MI6 launched a comprehensive review of their African intelligence networks, suddenly realizing they might have been dramatically underestimating African operational sophistication. Most shocking to Western intelligence analysts was the discovery that Traoré's network extended far beyond North Korea. In the weeks following Operation Sunrise, evidence emerged that similar intelligence cells were operating in China, Russia, Iran, and even within European capitals. The young African president had built what amounted to a global intelligence apparatus that rivaled those of major powers, all while maintaining the public persona of a regional leader focused on domestic development. The technical sophistication of the Pyongyang operation particularly impressed military strategists worldwide. The precise timing of the power grid failure, the seamless coordination of multiple infiltration teams, and the real-time broadcasting capabilities demonstrated technological resources that few intelligence agencies possessed. Defense contractors began reaching out to African governments, suddenly interested in partnerships they had previously dismissed as commercially irrelevant. For Dr. Park, now safely relocated in Geneva under a new identity provided by Traoré's organization, the aftermath of her betrayal of Kim Jong Un proved unexpectedly liberating. For the first time in her adult life, she was free to speak honestly about the regime she had served. Her debriefings with international human rights organizations provided unprecedented insight into the inner workings of the North Korean government, further damaging Kim Jong Un's international standing. Working with President Traoré showed me something I had never imagined possible, Dr. Park reflected in a secure interview facility in Switzerland. An African leader who commanded the resources and respect of major powers, but who used that power to protect rather than exploit. It was everything the North Korean system claimed to be but never was. The economic consequences of North Korea's expulsion from Africa were more severe than Kim Jong Un had anticipated. The continent had provided nearly 30% of North Korea's foreign currency earnings through arms sales, mineral extraction, and money laundering operations. The sudden loss of these revenue streams forced painful cuts to military spending, and further reduced the regime's ability to maintain control through economic rewards for loyalty. Chinese officials, who had invested heavily in North Korean African partnerships, expressed private frustration with Kim Jong Un's catastrophic miscalculation. Beijing had seen the North Korean networks in Africa as useful for Chinese strategic interests, and their sudden collapse represented a significant setback to Chinese influence operations across the continent. The psychological impact on Kim Jong Un himself was profound and lasting. Palace insiders, speaking anonymously to South Korean intelligence, reported that the North Korean leader had become increasingly paranoid and withdrawn following his humiliation by Traoré. He reportedly spent hours reviewing security footage from his own facilities, obsessed with identifying other potential traitors within his inner circle. The supreme leader's public appearances became less frequent and more scripted, as his confidence in his own invincibility had been shattered. The man who had once threatened to reduce entire countries, Tej now spoke more cautiously about international conflicts, understanding that his regime's vulnerabilities had been thoroughly exposed. 6 months after Operation Sunrise, Kim Jong Un attempted to rebuild his international credibility by proposing new diplomatic initiatives with South Korea and Japan. But these efforts were undermined by the widespread knowledge that his regime had been completely penetrated by foreign intelligence. Other world leaders now understood that agreements with North Korea might be compromised before they were even signed. The broader implications for African international relations were transformative. European and American diplomats who had previously approached African leaders with patronizing attitudes suddenly found themselves dealing with representatives who might possess detailed intelligence about their own government's secret operations. The psychological dynamic of North-South diplomatic relationships shifted fundamentally. At the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, a secure intelligence sharing facility was established, codenamed the Sunrise Center, where African nations began coordinating intelligence operations on a continental scale. The success of Traoré's North Korean operation had demonstrated the potential for African intelligence cooperation, inspiring similar collaborative efforts across multiple fronts. The center's first major operation targeted human trafficking networks operating between Africa and Europe, utilizing techniques developed during the North Korean infiltration. Within 3 months, 17 international trafficking rings were dismantled simultaneously across 12 countries, with European law enforcement agencies acknowledging that African intelligence had provided capabilities they couldn't match. For Traoré personally, the successful operation against Kim Jong Un marked his emergence as more than a regional leader. Intelligence chiefs from major powers began requesting private meetings, not to offer assistance, but to seek cooperation from someone who had demonstrated capabilities they respected and, in some cases, feared. The annual World Economic Forum in Davos, which had previously featured African leaders as recipients of development advice, suddenly found itself hosting sessions where European and American officials sought African insights on intelligence gathering and strategic planning. The transformation in global power dynamics was subtle but undeniable. Kim Jong Un's failed assassination threat had intended to eliminate an African leader who challenged North Korean interests. Instead, it had elevated that leader to the status of a global strategic player whose capabilities commanded international respect. The operation that was meant to demonstrate North Korean power had instead revealed its fundamental weakness: the inability to adapt to a world where African nations possess sophisticated intelligence capabilities. 1 year after that December night in Pyongyang, Kim Jong Un issued his first public statement acknowledging the importance of respectful international relationships based on mutual sovereignty. While he never mentioned Ibrahim Traoré by name, diplomatic observers understood the statement as a formal admission that North Korea would no longer interfere in African affairs. The transformation was complete. A dictator who had threatened an African president with death had been reduced to publicly pledging respect for African sovereignty. The supreme leader who had ruled through fear had learned to fear the consequences of underestimating African capability. For intelligence historians, Operation Sunrise would be remembered as the moment when African nations announced their arrival as sophisticated players in global intelligence operations. The continent that had been viewed as a target for intelligence operations by others had demonstrated its capacity to conduct operations that surpassed those of established power. The secret operation in Pyongyang had indeed ended Kim Jong Un's ability to threaten African sovereignty. But more than that, it had established a new principle in international relations. African leaders who possessed the intelligence capability, strategic planning, and operational sophistication to respond to threats with overwhelming force would no longer tolerate intimidation from anyone, anywhere, for any reason. The dictator who had learned to fear an African president had taught the world a lesson about the changing nature of global power. In the modern era, intelligence and preparation could defeat even nuclear weapons, and respect could no longer be demanded. It had to be earned through competence rather than threat.